Even though I don't have a grand thesis, I think that understanding, if I can borrow from Cardinal Newman, understanding the present position of Catholics in the United States will help us better understand the possibilities for a national conservatism, because I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Catholicism in America and national conservatism in America will largely stand or fall together. So let me set your minds at ease if you read the title of this talk. I'm not going to be talking about the historic anti-Catholicism in the United States. In fact, I would welcome that anti-Catholicism where basically the people we're in dispute with are Protestants who want to argue the finer points of theology and the faith and Scripture with us. It would be far preferable to where we are these days. Today there's a different bigotry that I think we have to all look at, and it's unacknowledged, and it's basically a rejection of all the pre-liberal principles on which any democracy, any society has to depend. The new bigotry is complicated, but it essentially boils down, it seems to me, to that you can preemptively dismiss all those things as mistaken because, to put it simply, they weren't woke. Now, it's very much to the point for this entire conference that this essentially goes unacknowledged in our society as a whole, that the natural markers of identity, by which I mean religion and family and nation, that my colleague Mary Eberstadt has written quite brilliantly about, can be ignored. That in most instances now, they're trumped by what I call the new holy trinity of race, class, and gender. But Catholicism, like its older brother Judaism, has much deeper roots than that. And it has survived radical shifts in cultures, the rise and fall of entire civilizations, even profound internal corruption. The modernist poet Ezra Pound once said that any institution that could survive the picturesqueness of the Borgias has a certain native resilience. And I would argue an accumulated wisdom over thousands of years as well. Now, obviously, Catholics are not the only ones subject to this kind of widespread, unacknowledged bias. But we really, I think, feel the brunt of it because when people talk about diversity, openness, the need for breaking down barriers, et cetera, language, I'm sorry to say, that even the leader of my church right now uses, not knowing what he does, I think, quite often. These words have come to mean their exact opposite. There's no diversity when it comes to social accommodation of Catholicism, real Catholicism, as I would put it. The minute our president, the White House is occupied by a Democratic president, what happens? There's a lawsuit brought against the Little Sisters of the Poor yet again because they practice the abomination of not wishing to pay for contraception in their insurance coverage of their employees, right? It's a sacrilege in the Church of Woke. I believe it would be helpful and less hypocritical at this juncture if instead of abstract and quite unserious crusades about accepting everyone, American and world leaders began to debate how to really respect different groups in the larger culture. I think we've done that more in this conference than happens in most public discourse in Washington, D.C. and throughout the country as a whole. And this means conserving what many people feel is threatened by political ideologies and by digital technologies now. I'm sure lots of you know people here in the United States or even abroad. I encounter this a lot when I travel outside the country. People saying they don't recognize their country anymore. And it's not just an American problem, it's a larger problem. That this sort of challenge and this obliteration of these natural connections that we have as a nation are regarded as a prejudice to hold on to those these days. And we see a pushback coming. We've heard about it in Hungary and Poland, and indeed all the Visegrad countries, but also France, Italy, the UK, and America. The French Catholic philosopher Pierre Manon has underscored the heart of the problem, it seems to me, when he talks about what's happened in France, which chose to admit many Muslims from its former colonies in North Africa, and seems unable to resolve the tension between this universal openness that he claims to have, of course, and the rejection of some people of that openness because it's presented to them on secular terms. As he puts it, the French system believes that problem shouldn't arise, but it does. And it's a challenge to the so-called openness of a secular society to find some way to accommodate really different points of view. Now, we just heard a brilliant talk from Rod Dreher about Viktor Orban. When Pope Francis met with Orban back in September, they spoke about immigration, because obviously this is a pope who's very concerned about refugees. The very first trip he made as a pope was to this tiny island of Lampedusa, which is an Italian island that's closer to Tunisia and Libya than Cuba is to the United States. And at that meeting, the Pope said that Christ's cross, and I'm quoting here, extends its arms to everyone. And sure, that's true. But no nation can extend its arms to everyone without committing suicide. What Orban is attempting in Hungary, of course, can be criticized, as any political movement can be, but it's not just defensiveness. It's not just Christian sectarianism to want to preserve a society in which people can feel at home, whether they're Christian or not. Because human nature is such that we can't live with chaos. We need order. And however idealistic openness may be, it does not necessarily does not necessarily lead to human flourishing. Now, the Pope aside, it's logical that the Catholic Church clashes with the current universal progressivism. For all its current weaknesses, and believe me, Catholics know how weak the Church can be in a variety of ways, the Church still holds to truisms that seem to lead people to believe that it can simply be canceled. Things like male and female, he created them. The sacredness of human life from conception to natural death, to the wisdom inscribed in the natural order. And in social matters, there's a proper balance between solidarity, where we love our neighbor, and on the other hand, the crucial idea of subsidiarity. It's a principle that the responsibilities that an individual or a family have should not be given to a higher power in the society because of what it leads to, as we know quite well. Many uninformed Catholics these days wax sentimental over every proposal that the government puts forward about poverty or about family, whatever it might be. Nancy Pelosi, our allegedly Catholic Speaker of the House, said the other day that she couldn't understand why people opposed family leave. It was even hard for her to make the argument because she couldn't understand why there was any opposition to it. Nancy claims to be a Catholic like our president does, and to not understand why people would object to giving $550 billion to various government agencies to interfere yet again in the family and in subsidiary civil society institutions. If you don't understand why there is pushback against that, it's pretty remarkable. I suspect Nancy hasn't been reading Catholic social thought very much lately. Catholic social thought, subsidiarity in particular, came to prominence in modern Catholic social thought because of the rise of communism in the former Soviet Union and of Nazism in Nazi Germany. In the 1930s, that was the period in which subsidiarity became more emphasized. And unfortunately, even in the Catholic Church, many people have forgotten the lessons from that period. But they can be learned again. Now, in this current period of chaos in the church, and someone asked me to speak about the Pope. I'm not going to do that, but it's clear that there's a kind of a chaos of both theology and of order in the church at this moment, and also chaos in our societies. It may seem that all this doesn't matter very much, that there are other concrete issues that matter a great deal more. But there's a reason. It's worth paying attention to this. There's a reason why even our secular media pay attention when a figure like Joe Biden visits the Pope, right? If the Catholic Church, as weak and as denatured as it has become in the past few years in many ways, can be induced to swallow a lot of what is liberal, intersectional, and woke, frankly, and we've never had an administration in this country that has been more radical than the one that's now being led by our second Catholic president. The resistance to the wokeism, I think, can be said to be all but dead. The reality of Catholicism in America, though, I think is something different, more mixed, and it still presents hope against the rising tide, and that's why I believe even the secular media and academia and Hollywood, et cetera, pay attention to what happens in the church. Let me give you a very modest institutional example of what I mean. There are still 1.6 million children in Catholic schools in the United States. It's the largest school system in non-governmental school system in the United States. It was created precisely because of that older anti-Catholicism that existed in the United States. My grandkids, throughout all of the plague year of 2020, went to a huge Catholic school in Northern Virginia, where we live. Went physically. They were literally in the school for all of last year, and there was no outbreak of COVID. If there had been, the secular media would have gone absolutely crazy about this, of Catholics spreading the plague. The fact that we didn't hear about that means it didn't happen. And it tells you something that no one has reported on this. That 1.6 million children, not every diocese has had its kids physically in schools, but still a large chunk of them have been, and it goes against the narrative that we keep hearing about COVID, right? And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the reason that this is not noticed is it goes against the narrative, that the federal health policy somehow is wiser and ought to be imposed on civil society institutions like schools. Remember when we used to talk about civil society, by the way, back toward the end of the Soviet Union? I want to emphasize, this isn't going to be an immediate solution, but the fact that there are so many schools and so many children in those schools is an indisputable fact. It's also an indisputable fact that 1/6 of the hospital beds in the United States are in Catholic hospitals. Plus, there's something like 1,600 long-term care facilities that are Catholic in the United States. Just this past week, the Supreme Court refused to hear a case of a Catholic hospital that refused to do a hysterectomy on a trans male. It's kind of hard to keep these terms clear in your head, a hysterectomy of a trans male. Now, the court refused to hear that. But at the same time, there's enough of a substantial presence in the medical community that if Catholic hospitals, healthcare facilities can be induced to resist, there is an institutional possibility of pushing back. Now, and in a much weaker sense, there also is an extensive Catholic higher educational network in this country. There are 197 allegedly Catholic colleges and universities in the United States. All the most Catholic ones do not have nationally ranked football teams, so you never hear about them. But there are a couple of dozen of them that are quite remarkable and formed a good number of students year in and year out who go on themselves to teach in high schools and grade schools and become professors elsewhere. And I would say that as difficult as the academic situation is in America these days, that too, if it gets good arguments, if it's encouraged to be brave, has a possibility institutionally of talking back to our prejudices. Let me give you another example of what I mean. Now, Catholics, of course, the Catholic Church institutionally recognizes individual responsibility and liberties. But at the same time, the primary cell of society in Catholic social teaching is the family, right? It's church, family, community, all prior to the political order. These are organic human communities. They're our kind of holy trinity when it comes to social matters. Now, as odd as that may seem to many Americans, because we emphasize individualism a great deal, human beings obviously do not pop out of the womb fully formed. It's a long process. Anybody who has kids know that it's a long, rocky, and indirect process to get them to be anything like a human being, right? It takes a long time for this maturation. And the Catholic Catechism says explicitly that education, the parents are the primary educators of their children. That's the Catholic view, and actually just, I think, the same view for most people in the world. I happen to live in the state of Virginia, where today, as you heard earlier, a Republican may be elected because his opponent said these 13 words: "I don't believe parents should be telling schools what they should be teaching." Now he's backed off in utter panic from that, because wokeism has finally come to the very home of parents with children. And I mean literally come home, when your kids come home and say, "Mom, am I bad because I'm white?" It used to be that the threat was in some ways limited. My oldest daughter went to a very good public high school in Northern Virginia, which is now very bad. This is about 25 years ago. And I remember when they first tried to implement a sex ed program there, I said to her, "Well, of course you're not going to take that, because there was an opt-out possibility." And she said, "Oh, sure, Dad." She's kind of a natural philosopher, theologian, and she understood the arguments. And instead, she was assigned to go and read in the high school library. So she came home that day, and I said to her, "Well, how many kids were there?" She said, "One." I said, "One? This is Northern Virginia, where there are Republicans, conservative Republicans, as much as anything else." Back then, the threat of homosexuality or promiscuity or whatever you want to think about it was so kind of diffused that hardly anybody got it. By the way, the one boy who was in the library with her was the son of one of the vice presidents of who's the guy from Prison Fellowship? Chuck Colson's Prison Fellowship. So you can imagine my daughter and her son. But now the threat has come home, literally. And you see this in the voting that's taken place. And as Ted Cruz was saying the other day, in a way, the cloud that has been overshadowing us has got this kind of silver lining. By the way, Terry McAuliffe went to a Catholic high school. He went to Catholic University of America and the Georgetown Law Center, and doesn't seem to have picked up much of Catholicism along the way. He's been lying. The school board has been lying about teaching critical race theory. You've probably also seen that there's this case where a girl was raped by a boy who was wearing a dress, went into a girl's bathroom, and the school board lied. The head of the school board actually said he didn't understand the question when he was asked if a rape had occurred in one of their schools. I mean, this is utterly implausible, right? But here, too, I think one of the reasons why there is some hope in this dark cloud, there is a silver lining to this cloud, is there is a pushback. When your commitment to trans ideology is such that you're even willing to kind of look the other way on a rape, people notice and they protest. And in this case, even the kids in that school, it's not very far from where I live, even the kids went out in protest. Let me circle back, as we like to say in Washington these days, to this family idea. Because in a strange kind of way, we've all been Freudianized, right? That somehow institutions, especially the family, are repressive. And maybe they were in the Vienna of Freud's day. Maybe strict religion produced neuroses. But Freud had not seen our day, in which the lack of family formation and the lack of religiosity can lead to all sorts of disasters. Now, in Catholic anthropology, one of the reasons why I think under terms of both faith and reason, the idea of the family as the primary cell of society holds water is that it works. Social science absolutely confirms that intact families, by which I mean a married mother and father, male and female, with children, trying to bring them up in religion and in education, is enormously helpful in reducing rates of promiscuity, of drug use, of criminality, all those things that we worry about in our society. And so you don't have to be a Catholic to think that there's a good reason, there's good reason as well as the faith element to think that supporting the family as the basic cell of society is a very good thing for human flourishing and for the nation. Am I okay with time?
About a minute, Bob.
Okay. Actually, I'm near the end. I'm surprising myself. I'm not this disciplined, so it must be this event is making me disciplined. Behind all of this, there's a larger issue, however, I want to say, and it's this. One of the reasons I think our societies are so agitated right now is that we've lost contact with those deeper sanities, with that deeper reality and deeper meaning that makes us all better human beings. It's not surprising that politics then becomes a kind of a substitute for the moral passions that most people used to feel with religion. And since politics cannot be the be-all and end-all of our lives, we're not going to live forever. There's something beyond that. The fact that we are committed to something beyond that actually makes our politics saner and more stable. Let me read to you, in conclusion, a passage from one of Roger Scruton's essays. He had this exactly right, it seems to me. Without the sacred, man lives in a depersonalized world, a world where all is permitted and where nothing has absolute value. That, I believe, is the principal lesson of modern history. And if we tremble before it, it is because it contains a judgment on us. The hubris, which leads us to believe that science has the answer to all our questions, that we are nothing but dying animals, and that the meaning of life is merely self-affirmation, or at best the pursuit of collective, all-embracing, and all-too-human goals. This reckless superstition contains already the punishment of those who succumb to it. That reckless superstition, I think, is part of the unacknowledged, deepest, largest bias that we exist with here in the United States these days. And when I think about it, and it seems so impossible that we'll ever overcome this cultural imposition that we now feel all around us, I think back to John Paul II myself. Because John Paul II believed, as no one did at the moment that the Soviet Union fell, that it could. It still had thousands of nukes. It still had the KGB. It still had the apparatus of oppression. But he knew that it could fall, as did Reagan, as did Margaret Thatcher. So we can choose to be woke and to be submissive to this insanity and unreality, or we can choose quite a different path. And I think in sessions like this, we already have. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bob. Next up, we have Rusty Reno, editor of...